Thank you for everyone coming to this special biochemistry seminar. There are a ton of you here, way more than we expected to show up, so that's wonderful. So I'd like to start the seminar with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respects the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of the province. So our speaker today is Dr. Barry. Dr. Barry hails from Brighthouse, a small town in West Yorkshire with a population of about 32,000, nestled between Huddersfield, Bransford, Halifax, and Leeds. Rich with history and character, and even carries a touch of legend, with Robin Hood rumored to be buried nearby. Once known for its flour and textile mills, this town also gained international recognition through its industrial valve manufacturing. First, carpets furnished the House of Parliaments, the QE2, and British Airways, while Braunsberg Engineering Plant, at one point holding the record for the world's largest regulating valve, remains a local land. The mills closed by the mid-80s, while with many later converted into apartment complexes, while the last flour mill was transformed into UK's tallest outdoor climbing structure. Brighthouse is also famous for the brass band, which won multiple world championships and spent 6 weeks at #2 on the UK single charts in 1977. Notable figures from the town include William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, Curious Atlantic Connection, Brigus, Newfoundland, even takes its name from Brighthouse. Dr. Barry left the UK to pursue his PhD at the University of Saskatchewan. Following several years in the pharmaceutical industry, he joined Brandon University, where he taught and conducted research for nearly a decade. In 2014, he came to Newfoundland to serve as head of the Department of Biochemistry, or now the Department of Human Bioscience, and he continues this role today. So I'll pass it on.
Okay, is this working? Yeah? Yes. Okay, thank you, Katie. So yeah, this will be a little bit different, as any students who've had my pleasure will no doubt be accustomed to. So what I'm going to do is, so for those of you who don't know, today is 100 years since Memorial opened its doors to students. The first students came through the door on September 15th, 1925. September 15th was also my first full day in Canada. Not quite in 1925. Okay, so yeah, this is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be very science-like, so to any of you who don't have a science background, you shouldn't have any problems whatsoever with it. And there'll be a little bit of all sorts in here. So just to set the scene, 1925, what was 1925 like? So the top movies in 1925 were The Big Parade, which grossed just over $4 million. That was the top movie of 1925. Just behind that was Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, which I didn't realize until now. This is not the Charlton Heston Ben-Hur, but the Charlton Heston on this. This is a silent movie, and it was the most expensive silent movie ever made. Your main movie stars: Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Douglas Fairbanks Senior, and Rudolph Valentino. So many of you probably have never heard of any of them. A few of the people in the front rows may have heard of some of them. It was also the year that Fay Wray made her leading role debut. What is Fay Wray most famous for? King Kong, yes. But her first leading role was in The Coast Patrol. It's also the year that MGM brought Greta Garbo to Hollywood. Music, which shouldn't surprise anyone that I'm bringing music in here. Mainly jazz and blues were the big things, although there was also country music going on. 1925 was the year that Louis Armstrong left his big band and started his solo career. Some of the main recording artists, Lonnie Johnson and Blind Lemon Jefferson, made their first recordings. Some of the big names, the original Queen Bee, Bessie Smith, who is right, sorry, my pointer's not working, who is right there. Top right there is Blind Lemon Jefferson, and in the bottom right is Jelly Roll Morton. Top song in 1925 was The Prisoner's Song by Vernon Dalhart. Never heard of it, wouldn't know it if it hit me on the backside, in all honesty. It's also the year that Sweet Georgia Brown was released. And it was the first time that there was an electrical recording that was publicly issued. That was done by Victor Talking Machine, or Victor. And within a year, Columbia and HMV had also switched over to doing electrical recordings of vinyl. Classically, it was the year that Prokofiev's Symphony No. 2 was premiered. And this one really surprised me. It was the year that Grand Ole Opry was first broadcast. Obviously not on TV. TV had not been invented yet. It was on radio. World of sports. There was no Soccer World Cup yet. That was still 5 years away. The first Soccer World Cup was in 1930. In what country? Not Dr. Healy. Anyone know what country? Who said that? Can you catch? I can't play frisbee. Stanley Cup. Apparently neither can whoever threw that. The Stanley Cup was still not being used for the NHL. That didn't start until 1926. The last winners in 1925 were the Victoria Cougars of the Western Canada Hockey League before the NHL took over the Stanley Cup. The Grey Cup in 1924 was won by Queen's University, who defeated the wonderfully named Toronto Balmy Beach Beachers, who remained in existence until the 1950s. The World Series, depends which one you want. The World Series was by Washington Senators, who defeated New York Giants, but of course, this was still when coloreds, blacks were not allowed to play baseball. So you had a separate colored World Series, and it was actually the first one in 1924, with Kansas City Monarchs defeating Hilldale 5-4, 5 games to 4, with one game tied. They gave up after 13 innings when it was still tied and just declared it a tie. So it was supposed to be a best of 9, it ended up with 10. In the Olympics, it was the first time, 1924, the Paris Olympics, was the first time that the motto was used: faster, higher, stronger. The big stars on the track were from Finland. Paavo Nurmi won 5 golds out of 5. Ville Ritola, 4 golds and 2 silvers in the longer distances. Harold Abrams and Eric Liddell are British sprinters. What are they more famous for? What movie? There we go. I can throw this far, but she can't catch. And Johnny Weissmuller won 3 swimming golds. What's Johnny Weissmuller better known for? There we go, Tarzan, the 13 Tarzan movies. I've got no hats left, sorry. So before we start, 1922, someone who's very famous in Newfoundland, Joey Smallwood. Joey Smallwood made a prophecy about what a Newfoundland university would look like. So, or what it would look like in 1972. So he predicted that in 1972, the population of St. John's would be 80,000 people. Anyone know what it was in 1972? Want to take a guess? According to the 1976 census, it was 81,000 people. That's a pretty damn good prediction. This is Joey Smallwood's prophecy of what the university would look like, and I'm not going to make any comments whatsoever. I'll leave it up to you as to how accurate this was. A beautiful white marble building. A spreading building surrounded with beautiful green swards, sat back several hundred feet from the asphalted roads. Well, we do have some asphalted roads now. This place looked a veritable gem indeed. He predicted that the university would be founded sometime between 1935 and 1945, around 1940. So he predicted that in 1972 it would be about 35 to 40 years old. He also predicted that it will be so well regarded that whenever a well-to-do man dies now, he is sure to endow a chair of professorship. The university is everybody's gift. Anybody want to give some money? No? You don't want to make Joey look good? No? Students from all over the country. Not only that, but many grown men. I'm not entirely sure what he meant by a grown man. I'm assuming a more mature student who had come back. And some of them were even married. Although, to put this into context, remember when this was, 1922? This is 4 years after World War I had finished and the Newfoundland population had been, especially the male population, had been absolutely decimated. So there was probably reason why he said this. I like this next part though. Education now was undenominational, free. Students have suddenly gone very quiet. I was expecting a round of applause there. And compulsory. The result had been to smash down most of the old-time bigotry, anti-sectarian hatred. That sounds rather relevant for today, doesn't it? By bringing children of all classes and denominations together. Education, anyone from the government here? Oh, that's a shame. Education system was now paid for and maintained by the state and the government. A special school tax was levied on people. And then making note that it's not just people who had children who were taxed, it was anyone. And I really like this one as well. The people of Newfoundland had, I learned, actually elevated the teacher to a pedestal and now regarded him, notice the word, use of the word him, as one of the most important persons in the community, instead of the lackey he used of old to be. I will make no comment as to what the current state of that is. Okay, so what did MUN look like in 1925 when it opened? There were 42 full-time students, which meant they were taking university courses, 5 of whom were in their second year. 4 of those passed junior matriculation in Latin, one with honours. So to give you some idea of this, the MUN profs didn't set these exams and they didn't mark them. The exams came from England and they had to be shipped away to England to be marked. Not entirely sure how your current profs would respond to that requirement, that all their exams would be vetted by someone else and marked by someone else. And Miss N. Wood passed intermediate exams in English, Latin, French, and chemistry. There were 6 special students. I have no idea what this means. It isn't explained on the MUN websites. I have absolutely no idea what this means at all. If anyone finds out, please let me know. And there were 53 normal school students. And by that, they were basically teachers in training. They were training to become school teachers. First president of the university, which I would hope you all know, is J. Lewis Peyton from here. J. Lewis Peyton came from, he was born in Sheffield. Yay. His job immediately before becoming president of Memorial, He was the High Master, basically the principal of Manchester Grammar School. He basically went from a high school principal to the president of Memorial College. But notice, he also taught. In those days, presidents, administrators also continued teaching. There's maybe an argument that that would be a good thing. A.J. Hatcher, who became the second president, was the prof for math and biology. Notice, each prof is responsible for more than one subject. Not just more than one subpart of one small subpart of a subject. A.C. Hunter, and this is A.C. Hunter here with 2 female students, was responsible for English and French. In chemistry and physics, there were 2 profs, G.F. O'Sullivan and J.L. Nickerson. Why were there 2? Because none of the equipment arrived for the chemistry labs. And O'Sullivan lasted until November, at which point he had a mental breakdown and left, never to be seen again. They managed to find someone to cover until January, when they managed to recruit Nickerson to take over. And S.P. Whiteway was the prof for British history, and the registrar was a Miss B. McGrath. That was the entire teaching faculty at the time. What was student life like? There were weekly meetings of student reps with the staff to discuss how things were going and how things could be improved. Not the worst idea in the world. For games and sports, it was divided between men and women. Men played football, both forms, association and rugby. They did Harrier runs and played ice hockey. The women played basketball, field hockey, and ice hockey. But there were no dedicated grounds. Sounds very familiar to today. What there were, the grounds that there were described as fairly level, 95% weed and 5% grass. They basically borrowed fields from, for example, Fieldians. The Fieldians Club was well established at that point, and they did some of their sports down at Fieldian grounds. So this is Memorial College. There's the fairly level, 95% weeds, 5% grass, certainly not the lush green pastures that Joey Smallwood had envisaged. But who was responsible for beautifying this up? There was no money for the care of grounds. Sounding awfully familiar again. But the students were responsible for planting trees and shrubs and bushes and beautifying the grounds. That was part of their responsibilities as students. So be careful about bringing up history. It may get you involved in more things than you want to be involved in. Students were also, and it was so, each week a different student was assigned to write a column for the local newspaper about what was going on at the college at that point and student life. And there was a general lack of scholarships for those in need. During the first year, they managed to collect $3,116, which in 1925 speak is a good chunk of money. And it was decided that priority needed to be given to female students for that. What? Woke didn't just exist in the last 10 years? Why? Because the men had access to Rhodes scholarships, which women didn't in those days. This, so these pictures are taken from the Munn website. This is some of the female students at Munn College, which on the Munn webpage, probably the title of it should probably be updated, is referred to as Girls of Memorial. Not the most up-to-date title for a photo. This was a report from Newfoundland Memorial University College, 1925 to 26, which I thought was very interesting. And yes, I did put this up for faculty to look at. We did not content ourselves with the lecture method. A man who's, notice man again, whose educational activities are confined to listening to lectures may have a certain amount of ill-assorted information, and he may success in being a bore, but he has not become a man of culture. So even back in the very first year, don't make students sit and just listen to lecture after lecture after lecture. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is kind of what the title was, and imagine what might have been in a human biosciences program in 1925. Yes, there wasn't a human biosciences program in 1925, so just indulge me. So to kind of lead into that, what does today's human biosciences program at MUN look like? Well, it's the only human biosciences program in Canada. And if you look at human biosciences programs in other countries, there's a whole mishmash of what they contain. There isn't a standard. So lots of different flavors. Oops. Ours consists of biochemistry, some nutritional science, some pharmacology, toxicology, and then what I've listed as proprietary additional ingredients, basically other things that seem like a good idea at the time and may vary with time that we've added in. And that, for those wondering, is kind of the unofficial department motto, and we'll just leave that there. Some people know what that is, others don't. I'm sure some of you will look it up. For those interested or unclear, without a science background, I've just added in some definitions, some very general definitions of what we would typically regard as being biochemistry, nutritional science, pharmacology / toxicology. Only difference between pharmacology and toxicology is dose. One cures you, one kills you. It's really that simple. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go through each of those and see what the state of the field was in 1925. What were the controversies? What are some of the things that might have been being discussed if there'd been those programs in 1925? So starting off with nutrition and food safety in 1925. Livestock-related infections, particularly associated with raw milk. There was not pasteurized milk. Well, there was a little bit, but it certainly wasn't required back in 1925. This was a major issue. So raw milk routinely caused typhoid fever, bovine tuberculosis, which does cause tuberculosis in humans, scarlet fever, diphtheria, brucellosis. You could catch all of these just from drinking milk. There was no widespread vaccinations or antibiotics yet. We'll come back to vaccinations later. In Canada, and yes, for those of you who don't know, Newfoundland was not part of Canada back then. It was its own dominion, basically kind of an independent little country. But in Canada, between 1912 and 1936, there were at least 8,000 raw milk-related cases of typhoid, scarlet fever, and brucellosis. 688 of which were fatal. Tuberculosis was not included in there because it was highly controversial as to whether you could catch tuberculosis from milk and whether bovine tuberculosis was transmissible to humans. So Robert Koch, do we have any biologists? None whatsoever. Wow. Okay. Okay, Robert Koch is basically the grandfather of microbiology. He was the person who discovered Mycobacterium tuberculosis. He also discovered the microbes responsible for cholera and anthrax. Like, he was a big, big deal. And he absolutely refused to accept that bovine tuberculosis could be transmitted to humans and that raw milk was a source of tuberculosis in humans. Absolutely refused to. Abraham Jacobi, who was a pediatrician and a very well known pediatrician. He remains the only foreign-born president of the American Pediatrician Society. Made this quote: "The lives of thousands of babies in the world are far more important than the reputation of one scientist." That was directed directly at Koch. So this would probably be a topic in classes. Is tuberculosis transmissible? What are the advantages of pasteurization versus raw milk? In New Brunswick in the 1920s, there was a 15% infant mortality rate before the age of 2 due to drinking raw milk. Today, you are twice as likely to die from drowning as you are from dying from a foodborne disease, any foodborne disease. Current infant all-cause mortality rate is 0.4%. 250, that is 250 times lower than the mortality rate just from milk-borne diseases in the 1920s. So what about pasteurization? John Gunyon Rutherford, this guy here, was the first Director General, first veterinary Director General, and he was a big proponent of mandatory pasteurization in the early 1900s, 1906, 1910. Why? Because his kid died from TB after drinking milk. Amazing how that personal experience colors what you think is important and not. But it was just a municipal level regulation whether pasteurization was needed. And in the 1920s, even where there was a regulation, it was mainly in urban areas. Toronto and Saskatoon were some of the earliest adopters of mandatory pasteurization. Ontario was the first province to make it mandatory throughout the province, and that didn't occur until 1938. When do you think it became mandatory Canada-wide? Anybody want to take a guess? (1991). This is kind of important today because this is coming back again. So you are 840 times more likely to become ill after drinking raw milk versus pasteurized milk, and 45 times more likely to be hospitalized. But we are seeing a resurgence in this, especially online misinformation, that raw milk is nutritionally better than pasteurized milk, and that raw milk has a lower allergen burden and therefore is not going to cause autoimmune disease or allergies. Be careful what you believe. So this guy, George Graham Lusk, was probably the godfather of nutritional science. He literally wrote the book that would have been used, and there's a reprint of it over here if anyone wants to look afterwards. So he wrote The Science of Nutrition. The first edition was in 1906. When you look through that, nutrition at that point was almost exclusively related to respiration, so oxygen intake, carbon dioxide exhalation, and intermediate, what we call intermediary metabolism now, deriving energy from sugars, from fats, proteins. And it was all very much thermochemistry based. It was very, very chemistry. Biochemistry was in its infancy back then. And until insulin, which we'll come up to, a lot of biochemistry was actually nutrition research. But if you look, this is the family tree of Lusk, and you can see why it would have been so chemistry favored. Direct link to Lavoisier, Gay-Lussac, Liebig, all of these big names that you hear in first year chemistry, Yes, blocked out. Okay, so a lot of work was on mass and energy or calorie balance and nutrient levels. How much fat was in a certain type of food, how much sugar was in a certain type of food. One of the big controversies, and Lusk was involved in this at the time, was can fat be converted into sugar in your body? So that would almost certainly have been a major discussion in those biochemistry and nutrition courses at the time. Top figure here is the sort of instrumentation that we're using. And this was the small setup. You can see there's all sorts of pumps and things. Rover in a little cage there, basically to measure oxygen use, carbon dioxide production. This is a modern day variety of that. You get 4 or 5 of them on this table here. So we're still doing the same sort of thing. So this is calorimetry. But for those of you who think that protests against use of animals in research is new, or that, let's just call it creative license, in some of protesters' descriptions is new, a pamphlet from the anti-vivisectionists from the 1920s about this and Lusk's experiment made the claim. An instrument, the calorimeter, for the torture of dogs in which they are roasted alive. But these were the sorts of things that were being put out to the general public to try and convert them to be against animal experimentation. Again, we see the same sort of thing today with the mass over exaggeration of what's going on and the misunderstanding. The word calorimeter, in chemistry, sometimes called a bomb calorimeter. If you want an amusing story, who's done 1001 or 1600? Okay, so you guys know Dr. Harding's story about the bomb calorimetry and working on bomb calorimetry and how you don't talk about that on the tube in London. Yeah. These are the chapters in Lusk's textbook. You'll see a lot of common things. Protein, a lot of chapters on protein, couple, 3 on carbohydrate. There's some on fat somewhere there on fat. This is the one that I find interesting. Out of 760 pages, there are an entire 3 pages devoted to the effect of drugs on nutrition. And by drugs, what were they meaning? Because these were the drugs that were commonplace at the time. Caffeine, okay. Heroin, strychnine, morphine. Heroin was a prescribed drug back then. We'll come on to that. Okay, those are just some papers from Fisk, some sample papers, just to give you an idea of the sort of work. And again, you can see how it's very chemical based. You have to talk about human studies though. This is pre-Helsinki Declaration and Nuremberg Code. There were no regulations on human studies. It was fairly routine to self-administer things and test what happened in those days. Okay, that's fine. You're doing it to yourself. You die, you killed yourself. Yeah. Sorry. However, it was very common that experiments would be conducted on school children as part of their school studies, in orphanages, prisoners, military personnel, and in Canada, residential schools. Absolutely horrendous experiments done. Forced starvation, deliberate withholding of nutrients to make people sick to study them. And more generally in indigenous populations. This was full colonial era. So it was very commonplace, for example, to use an indigenous African population and just do experiments on them. And those studies, if we're generous, were interpreted through a colonial lens. If we're honest, interpreted through an outright racist lens. Any adverse effects were because, well, they're foreigners and they're just lower genetic quality than us. Mid-1920s, we now, moving on to a little less somber topic, but we start to realize that food is not just calories. So vitamins became recognized. The name vitamin comes from vital amine. They originally thought they were all amines, and they realized that they were vital. Hopkins, this guy here, he did studies that showed that if you just fed animals pure protein, carbohydrate, fat, it didn't support growth. There was something else in food that was needed. And this is where they started to identify vitamins. So this would have been a new thing at the time. Studying vitamins and what vitamins were needed for. Hopkins also discovered tryptophan and glutathione. Funk, this guy here in his lab, was one of the leaders of linking vitamins to diseases and the use of vitamins essentially as a drug to treat or to prevent diseases. Elmer McCollum, this guy here, involved in discovery of vitamin A, but also in trace elements. So in the mid-1920s, we're now starting to also pay attention to minerals, metal ions, and their importance in nutrition. Had no idea why, but those were some of the things that would have been discussed. Hopkins was also the guy who promoted vitamin supplementation of margarine, because he did studies to show that margarine was nutritionally inferior to butter. And again, Dr. Harding's not here, so I can make fun of him widely. As those of you who've taken classes with Dr. Harding know, Dr. Harding prefers butter anyway, but there was no international dietary standards at this point. Mid-1920s, the League of Nations, which was the forerunner of the United Nations, had just started to release its initial documents about ideal diets and diet content. That first report did not come out until 1935, though. And I'm by no means a nutritionist, so nutrition people will be more interested in these numbers. Recommendations were for a sedentary adult, and by adult, anyone above 12, was for 2,400 calories a day. That was it. No sex differences were considered, other than if you were a nursing woman. Protein intake, basically high protein intake was recommended for children, which decreased with age. But recommendations to drink milk, eat eggs, eat fresh fruit and vegetables for protective nutrients. We didn't know what they were. Not vitamins, minerals, those sorts of things. But they were already talking about decreasing the use of white flour, because they already knew that the milling process to make white flour removed some of the nutrients from the grains, and that whole wheat was better. And this first report did indicate that you should provide extra vitamin D when sunshine was not abundant. Obviously, Newfoundland, with the cod industry, highly important, because cod liver oil good source of vitamin D. Okay, moving on to biochemistry, and this one will be fairly quick, because as I said, in the 1920s, biochemistry was largely nutrition. It was a relatively new discipline, so the Department of Biochemistry at McGill was only established in 1920. The Journal of Biochemistry was only in its 4th volume in 1925. So this was really a new discipline. The chemists generally didn't like it because they viewed their pure science as being diluted with all that biological stuff. And it was the people who weren't good enough to do real chemistry that were doing biochemistry. The biologists didn't really like it because it was, well, it's bringing all that chemistry crap into our world. It's not enough focus on biology. But what was known by the mid-1920s was that enzymes, so your biological catalysts, those things that speed up reactions in your body, they were now recognized as being proteins. James Sumner was one of the pioneers of that, and Dr. Healy gave a seminar on James Sumner last year, so I won't repeat any of that. But we also had enzyme kinetics now. Michaelis-Menten equation had been developed. And of course, Maud Menten, very famous Canadian. And we were starting to look at hormones. So insulin had been, insulin had been discovered years, intimated at years before. 1921 was when Banting and Best did their experiment with pancreatic extracts. This is one of the actual results that they showed. Interestingly, someone else had done this 16 years earlier. Eugene Glay had done similar experiments, but couldn't finish the study. And what was commonplace in those times were, if you did something like that and couldn't complete the study, because there wasn't that big push to publish, you'd basically put your results and all the descriptions of them in a sealed envelope, and you'd file them with one of the societies. So he'd filed his with the Société de Biologie in Paris, and it remained in the sealed envelope until Banting and Best published, at which point he said, oh, I did that 16 years ago. They opened the envelope and read it at one of the society meetings. In 1922 was when they used the extract on humans. Banting's extract was actually useless, in all honesty. It didn't work very well at all. But James Collip, who was a biochemist, Banting was a medic. He had no research training whatsoever. But Collip was a biochemist. He knew how to do the extractions better, and his extraction worked. And that was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And of course, they received the Nobel Prize in 1923. This is one of their experimental dogs. This is Banting, this is Best. And then in the late 1920s, we started trying to use insulin for other purposes. So it was being used in psychiatry, basically to put people into a hypoglycemic coma. The thought was that that would be useful for treating psychiatry, for treating schizophrenia and psychoses. That continued into the 50s, the use of insulin in psychiatry. So this triggered the expansion of biochemistry and started looking at hormones, these gland secretions from the glands. One of the others, again, Collip in 1925. So the function of your parathyroid gland, so this is the little gland that's basically connected but separate from your thyroid. The function of that was highly controversial. We knew that if you removed the parathyroid, it caused tetany. Basically, all your muscles spasmed up and you died. There was a thought that it was due to inability to regulate calcium. But there was also a thought that the parathyroid was a detoxifying gland. So basically, like we now regard the liver. And it was Collip who proved in 1925 that the parathyroid gland was releasing something, a secretion, that was altering the calcium levels. So this would have been one of the things that would be being talked about with respect to biochemistry, these hormones and these new gland secretions that were affecting things. Okay, title this protein regulation by phosphorylation. That is not what was being done back then. But because we didn't know anything about signaling pathways, but they were starting to show that in some situations, proteins contained phosphorus. And they knew that proteins were made of amino acids and the amino acids didn't contain phosphorus. So they knew that phosphorus could in some situations be incorporated into proteins, but because of the times, this was being looked at almost exclusively from a nutrient perspective. And did this enhance the nutrient aspect of proteins? Did it make them more nutritious by having phosphorus in them? We hadn't thought of it being a regulatory point for enzymes or something like that. Rimington, 1927, published work on this. Notice I've not mentioned this guy at all. DNA, RNA. Mid-1920s, you would be being taught in almost all likelihood that the carrier of genetic information was proteins. Because nucleic acids, DNA, wasn't thought to be complex enough. There wasn't enough complexity in it to have all your genetic information in it. They did know that chromosomes contain DNA, and there were some initial suggestions this may be related to heredity. But largely it was proteins, because they knew the components of DNA, 4 bases, a sugar, and phosphate. It wasn't viewed as there being enough variation and complexity there that it could explain genetics. So it was assumed that it must be the domain of proteins. So you would be being taught that proteins were your genetics. Okay, moving on to pharmacology. So today, basically any drug, anything you put in your body, any chemical you put in your body, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the targets for those are what we call receptors. Those weren't known in the mid-1920s, or enzymes. Although we are starting to see, obviously, gene therapy come in. In 1925, again, pharmacology was a new thing. And there was this big headbutting between pharmacologists and physiologists. The pharmacologists were basically using physiology models to try and work out how drugs had their effect. And from that, deduce what physiological functions of various things were. Almost everything in those days was a plant or gland extract. Heroin was initially developed as a synthetic version of morphine and marketed to treat morphine addiction. Well, I guess it would. But then, when they realized that didn't work, as a cough suppressant. This is an advert from Bayer. Heroin, aspirin, Lysotol. Do not confuse this with modern-day Lysotol. This Lysotol, I haven't been able to find out exactly what it was, but it was something that they proposed dissolved uric acid crystals to prevent gout in your body. There is a modern-day drug, Lysotol, which is a pain med. It's completely different. Amphetamine had been developed as a synthetic version of adrenaline and was being marketed as a drug. In 1932 as a nasal decongestant. And you would also see adverts like this in your newspaper for things like Dr. Castle's tablets. I have absolutely no, I tried all weekend to find out what was in Dr. Castle's tablets, and I cannot find it anywhere. But these generally contain things like opium, cannabis, heroin, maybe a bit of aspirin. And I know the text is very small here, but these were marketed for a whole range of things. Nervous dispositions, especially in women, because women are apparently particularly prone to nervous dispositions in 1925. And I'm going to move away from Dr. Christian right now. But for indigestion, it really was barely above snake oil. But there were no regulations about drugs. You could advertise these in newspapers and make any claim that you wanted in 1925. The big question, though, was how are nerves working? So in the early 1900s, we knew that nerves were separated from each other. And we knew that some drugs, curare, so this is a plant extract that came from the colonies, from South America. This is basically blow dart toxin. Nicotine, we knew that some of these things, they didn't do anything if you put it directly on the nerve. They didn't do anything if you put it directly on the muscle. You had to put it in this gap between in order for them to have an effect. So a lot of the experiments were done with really fine paintbrushes or even threads that were soaked in a drug, and what you were trained to do in the lab was to be able to direct this very precisely to look at the effects. So the pharmacologists were saying the communication between the two was chemical. The physiologist said, that's crap. That would be far too slow. It has to be electrical. They agreed that moving through a neuron, it was electrical, but it was how the end of a nerve communicated with the others. And they were looking at how do things mimic nerve stimulation or block it. So this, John Newport Langley, was the first description of what he referred to as a receptive substance. This is where the term receptor comes from. So he basically said the chemical characteristics of these drugs is not sufficient to explain the effects that they do. They must be combining. He thought it was another chemical that they were combining with, and it was basically A plus B gives C sort of thing. This only gained wide acceptance in the 1930s. Paul Ehrlich was actually an early adopter of it and used it to explain antibody-antigen interactions in immunology. And also used the concept for his antimicrobial studies, although most of those, because the early antimicrobials arose from the German dye industry. There were dyes that were being used to stain things, and they realized that it killed the microbes as well. And that's where the German pharmaceutical industry arose from, was out of the dye industry. So, early 1900s, we're starting to get suggestions that things might be, nerves might be talking to each other or to other tissues by releasing something. Or you can certainly interpret some of the comments that were made in manuscripts that way. When you look a little closer, what they were actually meaning was, so for example, you've got a nerve going into skeletal muscle. They thought it was the skeletal muscle that was releasing something. That the nerve electrical activity caused something to be released from the skeletal muscle, rather than the other way around. Henry Dale was the guy, or one of the guys who eventually got the Nobel Prize for solving this. He knew he wasn't interested in teaching. He knew he wasn't very good at it, so he got a job at Wellcome Labs, the pharmaceutical company, so he wouldn't have to teach. But he was encouraged by the CEO to do work on this new thing that they got, Ergo. It wasn't a new thing, but they got preparations of it. So Ergo is from fungal contamination of grain products. But his work on this isolated things like histamine, acetylcholine, tyramine, and tyramine led directly to the identification of noradrenaline from Ergo. They're not actually part of Ergo. the ergo preps they were using with were contaminated, and they were basically being putrefied, and they were being released from those contaminations. But it allowed them to isolate these. Of course, this, with what we're going to come on to, now you've suddenly got antihistamines that you can develop. You've got acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. And it was this guy, Otto Loewi, who initially did nutrition and metabolism work, eventually came into neurons, and in 1921, so this would be brand new at the time. And what he did is he took basically two hearts. One he denervated, removed all the nerves from, one still had nerves. He stimulated the nerves in the one with the nerve and had a cannula that connected that to the one with no nerve, and showed that if you stimulated nerves that caused the heart to beat faster, the one without any nerves beat faster. If you stimulated nerves that caused it to beat slower, the one without any nerves also beat slower. So really proving that there was a chemical being released. But no one believed him, to the point that the physiologists made him bring his setup to an international meeting and publicly demonstrate it to them. That's the picture from the meeting in 1926 of him having to demonstrate his experiment. Ask your current profs how they would feel if they had to do that for any of their studies. Eventually, the physiologists had to accept it wasn't electrical. There was just too much evidence. And in 1936, Loewi and Dale got the Nobel Prize for showing the basis of neuronal communication. Other things that might be in there, Pavlov's dogs. This was known from the early 1900s. Now, yes, you would normally associate this with psychology, but at the time, he was stimulating, causing secretions from glands to happen, or from the stomach. This could entirely be presented in the 1920s as part of that humoral secretions. So you might see things on Pavlov's dogs in there. War on drugs was ongoing back then. So Newfoundland was under alcohol prohibition until 1924, from 1917 to 1924. Canada was just 1918 to 1920. And this was because of the temperance colonies and the temperance movement. By 1920, they'd accepted in Newfoundland it wasn't working, but it took till 1924 until prohibition ended. The Americans, God bless them, kept going till 1933. In 1900, over 4% of the USA was addicted to opium. 1914 was the Harrison Narcotic Act in the States. So narcotic means to put to sleep. The Harrison Narcotic Act uses narcotic as a catch-all term for any drug. And this is where it made it that only IRS, notice this is a tax thing, IRS licensed individuals could prescribe opium. The actual first opium law was in 1875 in San Francisco, the Opium Exclusion Act, which made it illegal for Chinese to use opium. Because again, opium was being used medically and also abused. And the viewpoint back then was that Chinese, because of their genetics, could not handle opium. And so they were more likely to become addicted, so you just banned the Chinese from using opium. The racism is a recurring theme in some of these drug acts. Cannabis. Canada banned marijuana in 1923, and no one knows why. If you go back, this was actually an act to ban opium, and at the last minute, someone added cannabis on there, and no one knows why. You search through the records, there is no indication of why it was added in. It's thought the best explanation I've seen is the US at this time was really pushing the League of Nations to ban all drugs. And Canada thought that this was what was coming down the line and they were just getting ahead of it. 1928 is when the book Dope comes out, which is when you start to see images like this about marijuana. Until the 1930s, marijuana was actually called cannabis or hemp. It was changed to marijuana in the 1930s because that sounded more immigrant. The main users of marijuana were Mexicans. And it was absolutely a racism-based legislation initially. And I'm being signaled to stop. But anti-vaxxers were prevalent in the 1990s. Oh, 1990s, sorry, 1920s. This is just a little bit of background. But there were, in response to these vaccination acts, there were riots, anti-vax riots in the streets. And it was the same arguments that are being used today. An infringement of personal liberty. It's not natural. It's not divine. It's foreign substance. Exact same things that you see today. These are from even earlier, and this is what I'll finish with. Media cartoons about vaccines. That top one is showing people, this is in response to the cowpox and vaccinating for smallpox, showing people slowly turning into cows from receiving the vaccine. This is another anti-vax one. This one here is about drugs in general. And it's actually about nitrous oxide, laughing gas. And the because it was a chemical, it wasn't natural, and so it was bad. These are all from the 1700s. Same arguments recur again and again and again. Not quite as bad as the last time you let me loose.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Berry. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is do the draw for the 2 remaining prizes. So I know a few people may have to leave. And so this is if you happen to be one of the first 125 people through the door and you are still here, there are 2 pictures up here. I'm going to get Dr. Berry to draw numbers.
1. First one is
Beakers on the bottom, 21.
21.
And the second one, 39. We have one person.
Confide amongst yourself. As to which one you want.
I'd also like to thank you for giving the talk.
Oh, thank you. Yes, yay me.
And so we're running out of time, so I'll allow 1 question. Isaac.
Thank you, Dr. Berry, for that wonderful seminar. I have just 1 question. What is your favorite discovery in the field of biosciences that was vital to the advancement of modern medical research?
Neurotransmitters, that's easy. That's dirt easy. Lurvy and Dale, neurotransmitters. That led to basically every single, well, not every single, probably 85% of the medicines that are available today can be traced directly back to that.
Okay. So there's coffee just outside the door and some drinks. So you're welcome to stay for the reception and chat for a bit. Yeah, thank you all for coming. We had a great turnout.